I'm going to talk about how to address conflicts of interest in systematic reviews using the tool called TACIT. And as we talk about conflicts of interest, I'll let you show ours. So we are just disclosing that we are both, Asbjørn and I, members of the TACIT steering group. And so far, to our knowledge, we have no other relevant interest in relation to this talk. So the agenda of today is, firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, why this tool was developed and how we develop it. Then I'm going to show you the outline of the tool and focus on some of the different aspects of the tool. And I'll then do a brief practical walkthrough of the tool on an example of a trial. And then I'll point you to where you can find more information about TACIT. And lastly, we will have a Q&A session where you can So first, some background and development. So as you probably know, conflicts of interest are common in clinical trials, with around 2/3 of all drug trials having received industry funding in some ways. And if you look at drug trials, also 2/3 of drug trials having lead authors with financial interest. Non-financial interests are not as common, or at least not so often disclosed, but there's a huge amount of underreporting in relation to non-financial interest. And the focus of TACIT, as I'll come back to later on, is in this first version of TACIT on the financial interest of researchers. Not to say that non-financial interests are not important, but we'll probably address that later on. So what do we know about conflicts of interest in trials and outcomes? There have been various empirical studies trying to investigate this. One of the studies was our Cochrane review back from 2017, is the latest version, where we looked at trial funding, and we could see that there was an association between receiving industry funding and having statistically significant results in favor of the trial funder. In line with this, also having favorable conclusion and having received industry funding. If we go on to look at actual trial effect sizes, then Camilla Leisgaard published this study called the COMFIT study, where she did a systematic review of meta-meteorological studies. And you can see that for the trials where there was a risk that a commercial funder had influenced the trials in an important way. So not only was the trial industry funded, but the funder should also have the opportunity to influence the design, the conduct, analysis, and reporting of the trial. There was also an association. Please note that in this types of studies in metabiology, the OR is switched around, so less than 1 is actually showing an increased effect size in trials with a risk of commercial funder influence. And then lastly, in this study by Anne and co-authors, we saw an association between the lead authors having ties or financial interest related to the trial intervention manufacturer, in this case in drug manufacturer, because it was in relation to drug trials. And there was an association between lead authors having financial ties and the trials having results in favor of the manufacturer. So how do we deal with this in relation to Cochrane reviews? There have been 2 main studies looking at this, and they are somewhat old, or at least not so recent. One of them was the Turner study from 2020, where they sampled Cochrane reviews, and you could see that in 16% of these reviews, they didn't report on the trial funding in the Cochrane reviews. And it was even worse in relation to the financial interest of the trial authors, where more than half of the reviews actually didn't report that. On the other end of the spectrum, you can see that also in this study from 2016, that in around of 1/3 of Cochrane reviews in this sample, they actually included commercial funding as a separate bias mechanism. So some of them did that in the older version of the risk of bias 2 tool in the other domain, where they then added industry funding as a separate bias mechanism, which is in conflict with the line or the guides for the tool, both the ROB1 and ROB2. So based on this lack of reporting, and this on the other end of the spectrum, considering commercial funding to be as a bias mechanism, it was decided in the Cochrane bias method groups that there was a need for a new tool to try to address conflicts of interest in trial, to have a structured, coherent, and transparent assessment of conflicts of interest. And on that basis, it was decided to develop TACIT, and the intention is to guide systematic review authors in collecting, processing, and interpreting information on conflicts of interest in the included trials in the review. So, in line with other tool developments, we established a working group and a steering group. So we are 20 people in total who have been involved in developing this tool, where Asbjørn and I have been part of the steering group, together with Isabelle Breton and Leslie Stewart. And we collaborate with people who have both experience in tool developments, in trial and systematic review methodology, in research on conflicts of interest, and also we have involved people who are familiar with medical publishing, that being editors from both Cochrane and the BMJ. So further to inform our tool, we did 4 supporting studies. So the first study was to look at how did other appraisal tools actually include information on conflicts of interest, and how did they address it. In our second study, we interviewed experienced trialists to learn about which mechanisms exist for commercial funding and conflicts of interest to have a problematic influence on the trial, and which kind of checks and balances you can put in a trial in order to minimize the potential undue influence from conflicts of interest in a trial. In the third study, we tried to address the challenge with conflicts of interest, that being that in many trials, especially older trials, there's missing information on conflicts of interest, funding information, and in particular the role of funders in the trial. So we tried to look at what other types of information resources or sources are out there that can give us more knowledge about who did what in the trial, and whether there was a cause for concern about conflicts of interest in the trial. And the fourth study was a user testing study, or a pilot study, where we had 2 groups of users to try out TACIT in 2 different contexts, and giving us their feedback on a preliminary version of TACIT. So the tool has been now in development for some years, with different versions being iteratively revised, and this has been based on both input from the TACIT working group, but also valuable input from our supporting studies, in particular our 4 studies where we did user testing, but we also got feedback from previous workshops, participants, and other types of user feedback. The tool in its current form is aligned with the chapter on bias and conflicts of interest in the Cochrane Handbook that many of you might be familiar with. And in September last year, we launched a preliminary version of TACIT on the Open Science Framework platform, so it's freely available. And we have now entered a phase of public user testing. So for those of you out there who want to try out the tool, please do so, and we will be very glad if you can provide us feedback. And the idea is to collect this feedback and revise the tool and guidance document further, and then hopefully submit a final version of the tool over the summer of this year. So on this basis, I'll try to outline some of the concepts in TACIT and how it's structured. And then afterwards, we'll go on to look at a practical example of how to use the tool. So the tool basically has three concepts. So one of the concepts, and the main concept you can say, is that the idea about the tool is on trial level to reach a decision whether you think there's notable concern about conflicts in a trial, or whether you think there's no notable concern identified. And identified should be emphasized because in some situations, you cannot be 100% sure that no conflicts of interest exists. It's just based on the best of your knowledge. And for concern to be there needs to be two factors that should be present. So first of all, there should be conflicts of interest present, that being either the conflicts of interest of a funder or the conflicts of interest on the trial researchers. But also the person or the stakeholder with conflicts of interest should have been able to have influenced the design, the conduct, the analysis, or reporting of the trials in an important way. So it's not only that a trial is being funded by a manufacturer of a intervention, but also this funder should have had the ability to influence the trial in an important way. The other concept is based on the acknowledgement that in many cases, particularly for trials that are more than 10 years old, trial publications often have very limited information on the funding source, the author's conflicts of interest, and particularly the role of the funder in the trial and the role of the authors in the trial. So to take into this account and somewhat not included as a concept in other tools, they typically have a category called unclear or some concern. In TACIT, we have decided only to have two categories of concern, but then instead to have another domain where we look at the quality of information that the assessment of notable concern was based. So you can have a situation where it's very transparently reported in the trial publication that this was funded by a commercial company, and the role of the company in the trial publication was very clearly described. So you would say your assessment of concern was based on high quality information, but you might also, for an older trial, be in a situation where the funding was reported, but you are not really sure of what the role of the funder was in the trial. So you may have to rely on indirect information or proxy information in the trial. And in that case, you will then regard the judgment of concern based on low quality information. And the last concept is in order to reach adjustments about concern and quality of information, you are guided by guidance questions. So you will be familiar with the same concept in ROB 2 and ROB Me, where they are called signaling questions, but it's sort of the same concept that you are, as a user, ask different questions with the option of replying yes, probably yes, no, or probably no. And based on your answers in an algorithmic way, you'll reach a decision about whether there's notable concern or no notable concern identified, or high or low quality information. So TACIT is structured around 3 steps. So firstly, you will go and look at the trial funders, and you will then judge whether there's concern about conflicts of interest and judge the quality of information that your judgment of concern was based on. You will then do the same exercise for the primary academic researchers, and by primary academic researchers, we mean any researcher, typically a trial author, so the first author, the last author, this corresponding author, and any academically employed trial statistician, and judge whether they have any conflicts of interest, and further the quality of information that your judgment was based on. And then lastly, based on the information and your judgments in step 1 and 2, you will then reach an overall judgment on trial level, both in relation to the concern about conflicts of interest and the quality of information. So in essence, step 3 is done automatically based on your assessments or judgments in step 1 and 2. So one way to, and I'll get back to the practicalities about this when I do my walkthrough in a bit, but just to show you that TACIT is centered around a Word-based or a PDF-based document called the TACIT grid, where you fill in the information similar to what you can see for instance, other appraisal tools like Risk of Bias tool, RobMe, and other tools. It should be important to know that TACIT in its current form is mainly focused on trials of interventions with a potential commercial value. So that could be drug and device trials, but also behavioral intervention or nutritional interventions. And the main focus is on financial interest. You can also use TACIT to address non-financial interest, but the current guidance and the guidance document is not as detailed on that. And we hope further on to be able to develop and provide more guidance on how to address non-financial interest. They are also important, but have been less studied empirically, and therefore we started out with this first version of the tool to focus on financial interest. One take-home message from our user testing was that a lot of systematic reviewers, they feel kind of overwhelmed with the amount of tools out there to be used in reviews, and they are quite busy. So they really wanted a tool that was as simple as possible and was as little time-consuming as possible. So in order to try to address these needs, on one hand, we didn't want it to be too simple and overlook issues, but on the other hand, we thought it also to be user-friendly. We needed to address these concerns. So the tool allows bypassing of steps. So one possibility is that if you already know that a trial will on overall level be judged as notable concern for conflicts of interest due to the amount of conflicts of interest related to the trial funder that was, for instance, a manufacturer that was also involved in the trial, you can then skip the assessment of the primary academic researchers, because in principle it will have no consequence of your assessments, because it will automatically be notable concern of conflicts of interest for the funder. In the same way, for a trial where you have found that the first author has conflicts of interest and you know the first author was importantly involved in the trial, you may also then decide that you don't need to assess the conflicts of interest of the last author or the academically employed trial statistician. So these are options that you can use, but you can also do the full assessment if you want. That's up to the individual systematic reviewers. So one challenge that I have already highlighted is that particularly for older trials, there's a lot of missing information. So the default option is, or the default in TACIT is to kind of focus on the main trial publication, typically the first publication of the trial with the results, and the disclosure forms, either the disclosure information in the trial publication or for many journals, there's also a separate ICMJE disclosure form uploaded on the journal website. In some cases, not all information necessary for the TACIT assessment is contained in these sources, so you need to go to other sources such as trial protocols, for instance, to know what the involvement of the funder was in a particular trial. In a few cases, despite searching other information sources, you are not really 100% sure about who did what in a trial, for example, or whether, or maybe who the funder was. And in such cases, we have provided in the TACIT guidance document some assistance for you as a user of the tool to rely on proxy information for indirect assessments. Also, to reflect this, these cases of poor reporting and poor information, we have included quality of information as a concept in TACIT. As you remember, that your judgment can be on either high quality or low quality information to reflect this uncertainty sometimes in relation to your judgments. In line with other appraisal tools such as ROB2, for instance, you might be familiar with this kind of traffic light system. So you can display your assessments of the individual trials here using colors. And in TACIT, for the funders, the primary academic researchers, and the overall level, our scheme includes both information on the quality of information and on the concern. So you'll see in the Jones 2011 trial, there's no notable concern identified in relation to the funders, and it's a fully green circle. So that means it's based on high quality information, whereas you can see that it's only the border of the circle that's in green for the primary academic researchers, because in that case it was based on low quality information. For example, that it might be that the trial did not include sufficient information on the conflicts of interest of all the primary academic researchers. The TACIT assessment may also inform review analysis, and in essence, there are two ways how it can do that. So one strategy could be similar to when you do risk of bias assessment, to do a subgroup analysis where you stratify trials into those with notable versus those with no notable concern identified. So this can be depicted in this way in a forest plot, where you stratify with no notable concern and notable concern, and then do a test for interaction. You can also decide to do a sensitivity analysis, for example, restricted to trials with no notable concern based on high quality of information, and to test the robustness of the findings of your primary analysis as an example. TACIT may also feed information into other review tools. We have made some guidance for this, and especially the ROB-Me has already been integrated with TACIT. And the idea is that in some cases, for instance, in cases of missing information related to a bias assessment, or you judge a trial maybe based on poor information on some concern, but then you know, for instance, that the outcome assessor in the trial has notable concern about conflicts of interest due to, for instance, patent ownership, then you might decide in such specific cases that you then think that in reality there's probably high risk of bias in relation to outcome ascertainment due to important conflicts of interest and involvement of the outcome assessor. Similarly, it's quite known that in many commercially funded trials, they are more exploratory than pragmatic, and in many cases, the PICO might be a little bit different than your review PICO, for instance, in relation to the population enrolled in the trial or the choice of comparator intervention. And therefore, knowledge about a trial having notable concern may help review authors appraise the trial for applicability in relation to the results, for instance, as addressed by the indirectness domain in grade. So I'll now move on to a practical walkthrough of the tool. So in this example here, we are going to look at this drug trial of atogepant for the preventive treatment of chronic migraine in the PROGRESS trial. So this is a trial published in The Lancet in 2023. So I'll just show you here how you can then assess a trial using the TACIT grid. And the colors marked in red is the information that's having been entered on the TACIT grid based on this particular trial. So this particular trial is funded by two companies having co-developed the drug, Allergen and AbbVie, and as an optional feature in this TACIT grid, you can then describe what the funding really amounted to. So apart from monetary funding to run the trial, it also involved provision of the drug and involvement of co-authors and medical writers hired by the funders from a contract research organization. And this information is actually already collected as part of a typical Cochrane review. So this is just a way to process the information. So it's not any kind of extra work for review authors, because in reality, they already collect this information. So based on this information, you then have to assess whether you think these conflicts of interest are important. And in this case, the trial was funded by the manufacturer of the intervention, and it's a commercial company who have a very high interest in the trial having a favorable result. So you say that in this case, you think that the conflicts of interest of the funder are important, and you click yes here in your guidance question. And you then also look at how the funder was involved. And in this case, marked in red here, you can see that the funder was involved in nearly all aspects of the trial, from designing the trial to acting as co-authors and being involved in data analysis. So this leads to you to judge the trial as notable concern about conflict of interest in relation to the funder. So we then, this is a trial that has been published in the Lancet in recent years, and they are typically quite transparent in reporting of both the funding, the conflicts of interest, and the role of the funder. So in this case, we had all the necessary information for our judgment. So we judged the trial as high quality information in relation to our judgment of notable concern for the funder. So in principle, we could have skipped the next step 2, because we already know that the trial will have notable concern on overall level about conflicts of interest due to the important conflicts of interest of the funder. But in this case, we also decided to look at the first academic author, the lead author of the trial, and we can see that this person had multiple financial relationships with one of the commercial funders, AbbVie. So in this case, we judged that there are important conflicts of interest of the one of the primary academic researchers. And for primary academic researchers, we don't look at their involvement in the trial, because for them to be a lead author or a primary academic researcher, by default, they will have been importantly involved in the trial, because they will have a leading role in the trial. So we only assess whether conflicts of interest are present to an important degree. And this was the case for this first author. So we also have notable concern about conflicts of interest for the primary academic researcher. And in line with the quality of information for the funder, also here we say this, our assessment is based on high quality information. So based on the information in step 1 and 2, automatically the trial will be notable concern about conflicts of interest at trial level and based on high quality information. And the example I've just used is available on OSF if you want to look at it in more detail. I'll now just present some of the available information about TACIT that you can find out there if you are interested in trying out the tool in practice. So at this link at the Open Science Framework platform, we have included both a Word-based and a PDF-based version of the TACIT grid. We also have included a guidance document which explains both the development of TACIT, the empirical basis for the development, and a detailed explanation on how to use the tool in practice. And it also includes additional tables, for instance, in relation to what types of information sources you may search if you can't find all the necessary information in the trial publication, and also a table for what to do in cases of indirect assessments if information is simply missing from the different information sources, what proxy information you can use for reaching decisions about the judgment of notable concern of conflicts of interest of funders and primary academic researchers. And lastly, we have also made an Excel-based version of the TACIT grid for ease of use. It was really emphasized by our user testing that a lot of users, also based on their experience with other appraisal tools, really preferred another format than the typical Word template versions of tools. So I'll just briefly give you some examples here of our Excel-based application. So it's inspired by the RUB2 Excel-based version that many of you might be familiar with. So the idea is that instead of putting the information into a Word-based template, you will have these Excel boxes you can fill out with the necessary information. And instead of providing a lot of footnotes to the Word based template, which can provide you with noise, and especially if you are a trained assessor, you think the information is necessary. Instead, here in the Excel-based version, the information is hidden, but you can then display it with a mouse over for all of the asterisks here, or in the case of the question mark here, you can get additional background information if you click on the question mark. So it makes it simpler compared to the Word-based template, but also actually includes more information than the Word-based template. So here's just an example of how you can record funding information in the trial in a stepwise fashion. And lastly, the Excel-based version allows you to give you output in these TACIT-based traffic light figures that you can then include in your review. If you use the Word-based template, you need to do that manually, but you can use this Excel-based version to assist you in providing and making these figures. Try out our tool and provide feedback. If you visit our website called TACIT.1, there'll be a link to OSF, and there will also be contact information on how, if you're interested in providing user feedback, we'll send you a template that you can fill out, or you can also just write us an email about your thoughts on the tool. So this floor is now open for questions.
Okay, thanks, Andreas. So we are waiting for our audience to raise questions. We have first one, but before we get to that question, I would like to use the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. So first of all, this URL with the preliminary version of the TACIT tool, which is on Open Science, is that correct? How does that relate to this TACIT.1? Because you've shared I mean, we have two URLs. One is TACIT.1.
Oh,
the
yeah.
other is
So
OSF.
So TACIT.1 is just our website where we provide information about who is in the working group, and we have a timeline on the production of TACIT, and we point to relevant publications, whereas the OSF actually includes the actual tool and supporting documents. So So the TACIT website, TACIT.1, is more kind of like a background information for those interested and providing contact info.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have one question saying if we downgraded one level in risk of bias 2, do we continue downgrading indirectness in grade? I don't know if that's related to this tool, actually.
Well, it's actually two different concepts, but you could imagine that you would have like you will have an intervention where you do a systematic review, and in the case the only trials out there, they are all funded by the manufacturer, and it might be that there are some bias-related problems. Though in many cases, conflicts of interest won't directly influence bias, but it might be in those particular trials it did. In that way, you will downgrade due to risk. It could be like outcome reporting bias, for instance. You will downgrade based on that. And then when you do your TACIT assessment, you might notice that they are all funded by a manufacturer. So you think, okay, I might be able to pay particular attention to the PICO in this trial. Is it really reflecting the PICO in my review? And then you can see that in these trials, the commercial funder actually did not compare it to the best standard of care, but they chose an older drug and they gave it in a very low dosage that was not what is recommended in the guidelines. So in that sense, you decide to downgrade for indirectness. But in principle, it's kind of different concepts. TACIT can help you to notice things in a trial about when you do your indirectness assessments in grade, or when you do a risk of bias assessment, but it doesn't directly feed into it. I hope I answered that, if I understood your question correctly.
Okay, so the next question is roughly how long does it take to complete the tool or to complete the assessment, right? For a trial, I guess.
So TACIT will depend on your experience with the tool, because especially if it's a newer trial and you have your trial publication and you have downloaded it because you also need to do risk of bias assessment based on that, you can very easily do it in around 10 minutes. But sometimes you need to go to other information sources, such as retrieving trial protocols, going to clinicaltrials.gov or other registry information. And especially if you are very new to it, it can take longer time. In our user testing, it took sometimes up to 30 minutes per trial for some trials, but we could see a learning curve. So the more trials you did, the shorter time it took. And when we did our user testing, it was not the option of having these bypassing steps where you like skip step 2 if there's already notable concern about conflicts of interest of the funder. That was not an option that was available. So if you use bypassing steps, it will probably also reduce the time. So it's not as time consuming as using ROB2, for instance, but it does take some time, especially for older trials where information is missing. For trials of newer intervention, it's much faster, because all the necessary information is in the trial publication.
Right. And can the tool be used for observational studies?
So in its current format, trial TACIT is focused on like randomized clinical trials. Our hope is that later on we will also provide additional guidance for observational studies, and probably also for diagnostic accuracy studies, and also in relation to a non-financial interest, as I alluded to. But the focus of the current version of the tool is randomized trials, mainly of interventions with a a commercial incentive. I think some of the issues with observational studies would be that whereas the consort guidelines ensures that at least recent trials, they are very good in many cases of reporting the involvement of the funder. I think the involvement of the funder in many observational studies would not be as clearly described. So in my experience, it can sometimes be harder to try to tease out what did a commercial company actually do? What was their involvement in a observational study?
Okay, so while we're waiting for any other questions, I have a couple of questions on my own. First, at the beginning, you've presented how there is some research indicating some kind of relations or relationship between the commercial funding and the outcomes of the trials or the results of the trials. And how come that this assessment of impact of conflict of interest has been decided not to be part of the risk of bias tool? How come it's not considered a risk of bias assessment?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I probably did not put too much attention to that in the beginning of my presentation. So historically, there's been a huge debate about what this association between funding and favorable trial results and conclusions actually means. Is it because there exists a type of industry bias? And if so, is this a bias mechanism that's separate from the other mechanisms of bias that we have empirical evidence for, such as allocation bias and reporting biases or performance bias? And there are examples that commercial funding can lead to bias, but if it's bias, it's typically like the most well-known examples are like the reporting bias, like publication bias, for instance, in trials of antidepressants, as done in Eric Turner's famous study on antidepressants, where you could see that if you looked at the published evidence and compared it to the clinical study reports from the companies, you would completely overestimate the effects of antidepressants if you only relied on the published literature. So the idea is that that industry bias is not a separate bias mechanism, but it's kind of mitigated through the usual bias mechanisms, typically reporting biases. So in that sense, it should not be seen as a separate. Then on a second note is that many of the issues related to commercially funded trials that are problematic is not to do with bias, but with other issues such as, for instance, the applicability of results. So, for instance, the choice of an inferior comparator. So it's well known that in many commercially funded trials, the companies, especially in head-to-head trials, they do not pick the best of their competitors, but typically one that doesn't perform very well, or they give it in a lower dosage. But this is not an issue of bias. This is actually something to do with the applicability or the generalizability of results. So in that sense, conflicts of interest and TACIT deals with a range of other issues than bias, and therefore it should be seen as something different.
And sorry if I missed that during presentation, but once you have your assessment of, say, conflict of interest risk, or what do you actually do? How do you use that in a review?
Yeah. So first of all, what I try to show you was this, you can kind of visually display, so you can give an overview. Okay, is this evidence that I have? is it just aren't there any concerns at all related to conflicts of interest, or are there some conflicts of interest at play? And if you have that, you can then say, okay, let me see, could it impact on my analysis, for example? And then you can do a subgroup analysis where you stratify trials into those trials with notable concern about conflicts of interest and no notable concern, to try to look, okay, can conflicts of interest actually be an explanatory factor in relation to the heterogeneity of our trial results? And if you can see that it does, you might then try to further explore what is the reason for this. If you see that the effect is stronger in the trials with notable concern about conflicts of interest, it could be due to, for instance, that the population is different. It could be due to the choice of the comparator, or it could be due to maybe reporting bias issues. So TACIT provides you sort of with an overview and some information that can be used in your review, but more like an exploratory type of tool, feeding information into other review tools.
Okay, so one final question from my side. So are you familiar with the Inspect SR tool?
Yeah, and
Right, so we are
involved in that as well. Yes.
okay. So I'm just kind of to use it as a plug for our webinar next month on March, I think it's 19th. Yeah, and I'm providing the link here for anyone interested. So perhaps you can tell us, what's the relation between Inspect SR and the TACIT tool, how they relate to each other and how they used.
Yeah. So in a way, you can say that TACIT, it deals in some sense with research integrity or conflicts of interest, and Inspect SR, which is a tool to detect problematic trials where you think there are research integrity issues at play, for instance, with data fabrication or falsification. It has some related concepts, but they are in essence two completely different tools. So in TACIT, you try to think about whether you think there are conflicts of interest at play that in some way could have influenced the trial. But in Inspect, you are not really looking at kind of the motives. You are more looking whether you think, are these data actually trustworthy, or did someone fabricate them or falsify them? And it was debated, I think, in the early phases of developing Inspect SR, whether conflicts of interest in some way should also be included as a sort of item in relation to Inspect SR, because you could argue that if you have conflicts of interest, it might be a motivating factor for you to fabricate your data. But as far as I remember, the empirical evidence on research integrity issues in relation to fabrication and falsification is very limited, and there's no studies to point out that like trials with conflicts of interest have more use of fabrication or falsification. Whereas we know with reporting bias, it seems that conflicts of interest, that's kind of probably a mechanism where conflicts of interest can influence the use of reporting bias. So yeah, that's yet another tool out there. So that's also why they have been kind of developed at the same time. So we acknowledge that review authors are already really burdened with a lot of tools out there. So the idea with TACIT is to try to keep it as simple as possible without kind of losing the nuances of the tool.
Okay, thanks. So we have another question. When sponsors are not funders, should their involvement be considered as non-financial conflict, or should we also consider them in the TACIT assessment?
Yeah, so the term sponsor is used a little bit differently in different contexts. In TACIT, when we understand sponsors, it's kind of who has the legal responsibility of the trial. And in many cases, the sponsor, particularly for commercially funded trials, the sponsor is also the main funder. So you can use information on sponsorship as a sort of proxy information that the funder was involved in an important way. If you have no other information, but you can see on clinicaltrials.gov that, for instance, a drug company, they were the sponsor of the trial, then they were highly likely importantly involved in the trial. But could you get back to me so it was the non-financial, or can you?
Yeah, if sponsors are not funded, should their involvement be considered as non-financial conflict, or should we also consider them in the TACIT assessment?
So I would think that the example would be then that you have a public or commercially funded trial, and then the sponsor it could be like the university department or an academic, and in such a case, we wouldn't consider that as a conflict of interest, because it will probably depend on a case by case basis, but on average, I won't say they have a particular motive whether that a trial would show a favorable result towards treatment A versus B. So my general take would be that it will probably not be a problem or something that should be taken into account. But it will probably vary by case basis.
Can you perhaps just clarify a little bit between interest and conflict of interest? Because that may be in relation to this kind of sponsor and funding. Because I think there may be interest, but I don't know. Or can it be can there be an interest without conflict of interest? Is that something?
Yeah. So usually in the literature, when you say you can have interest as a researcher, and then in some cases these can be both financial and non-financial, and in some cases these interests, which you also call secondary interest, they can clash with your primary interest. And as an academic, your primary interest would be to research, to trying to find out whether treatment A is better than B. That's kind of your primary interest. But if you have financial ties with the manufacturer or strong intellectual interest, these interests might clash, and there's a risk of an undue influence on your assessment. And in those cases, you would then say there's a conflict of interest because these two interests, they clash. But you could also say, like, for instance, imagine I'm trying to do a trial of a diabetes drug, and I have financial interest with a company producing prosthesis for the knee. So in that case, I have financial interests, but they don't result in a conflict in relation to this particular trial, because like the hip prosthesis company, they are completely they don't care whether the new diabetes drug works or not. So conflicts of interest are quite context specific. So sometimes your financial interest may result in conflicts, other times they don't.
Okay, thanks. So we don't have any further questions. Just perhaps if you can tell us, is this testing of the preliminary version, is that still going on? Is that something we would still expect?
It will probably close before the summer. So anyone interested, please try to visit our TACIT website and get in contact with us. If it's only using the tool for one trial, we'll be happy to have your feedback. So please stay in touch and share your experience and try out the tool.